Welcome back. I would like to just draw your attention to a couple of things before the next panel begins. One is that at the back of the program there is a log, and based on the conversations, I know that there have been numerous ideas generated. We would ask that you complete that and turn that in at the end of today. Secondly, for those who would like still to record your story, the videographers are available. There are some slots at about 4:45 and later that is still available. So please just go out and let them know. Let me turn this panel over to Daniel Webster on policing and racism.
Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Webster. I'm a professor of health policy and management here at Johns Hopkins and the Bloomberg School of Public Health. I direct our Center for Gun Policy and Research, and I also direct a new initiative that I'm very excited about, a collaboration between Johns Hopkins and Baltimore Police called the Johns Hopkins Baltimore Collaborative for Violence Reduction. I'm very excited about today's session. Obviously, it's a topic, race and policing, that has been on our minds a great deal for many years, of course, and particularly right now as we approach anniversaries of unrest in Baltimore here. We have a great session lined up for you, and mostly what I get to do is tell you who they are, listen to their wise words, and then at the end I will facilitate some Q&A that I'm hoping everyone will engage in, give us some good questions for discussion. Our first speaker is Sherrilyn Ifill. She's the 7th President and Director-Counsel of the NAACP's Legal Defense and Educational Fund. She was a fellow at, before that she was a fellow at the American Civil Liberties Union, and then for 5 years served as an assistant counsel at NAACP's Legal Defense Fund's New York office, and then left to join the faculty at University of Maryland's Law School, where she continued to litigate and consult on a diverse range of civil rights cases. And she founded the first legal clinic in the nation that focused on the important task of removing legal barriers to formerly incarcerated persons seeking to responsibly re-enter society. She returned to NAACP's Legal Defense Fund in 2013 and increased the visibility and engagement of the organization in cutting-edge civil rights issues, including policing reform and the Detroit water crisis. At critical moments during national unrest in 2014, her voice and vision framed the issue of policing reform and urban deprivation with powerful clarity in media appearances, op-eds, and other venues. I'd like to invite Ms. Ifill to give us our keynote address, and then we'll get to our discussions.
So thank you very much. I could not be more thrilled than to be with you today at what is, as we're coming towards the end of the day, of this extraordinary gathering. And I was incredibly encouraged to come in and see how many of you were participating actively in the breakout sessions and engaged in conversations with your colleagues about the issues facing the city of Baltimore. And I want to thank Professor Blum in particular for connecting me with this effort, and Professor Webster for that introduction, and my co-panelists who you'll meet in a little bit, who are going to treat you to a very lively conversation. Let me give you a little context, and then I'll jump into the meat of my conversation. I want to be able to be very, very transparent with you. I have been all over the country over the last 2 years. Indeed, this is my 4th year leading the Legal Defense Fund, and many of you know how deeply devoted I have been to Baltimore over the last 20 years. I raised my children here in Baltimore City. I moved here in 1993, and many of you don't even know that I'm not a native Baltimorean because I embraced this city wholeheartedly as it embraced me. And I set myself to the task of being engaged with the most difficult problems in this city. I was just chatting with my old friend, Brother Bay, about that clinic that Professor Webster mentioned. It actually was the 2nd clinic in the country that focused on reentry of ex-offenders. And I did environmental justice work. I did lead paint work. I taught a reparations clinic. I mean, I tried every way I could to get my hands around the problems that I saw that related to race and civil rights. In 2007, I wrote a book about the last 2 recorded lynchings in Maryland as a way of pressing the conversation about the way in which the history of racial violence presses on us and is with us today and remains unresolved and continues to express itself in the problems that we confront. And so, because of that experience here, I rejoined the Legal Defense Fund. As Professor Webster said, I was a young lawyer at the Legal Defense Fund from 1988 to 1993 before I came here to Baltimore. When I returned to lead the organization in 2013, I came carrying with me the very rich experience of living in and grappling with the challenges, and for me also the joys of living in and being a part of the Baltimore community. I was pressingly aware that I was and am leading the organization founded and created and first led by one of your most critical sons, native sons, Thurgood Marshall. And so his work and his example is always before me. And what I draw from his work and his example are several things. One is the need to think big about how to solve big problems. 2 is the importance of refusing to accept the existence of what appear to be unmovable obstacles. And finally, my experience as a civil rights lawyer over 25 years has taught me the importance of asking the right questions if one seeks to find good answers. So I found myself over the last 2 years, as the nation has grappled with the issue of police violence against unarmed African Americans, I found myself very often, sometimes it would happen on national television, asking questions that it seemed like no one else was asking. When Ferguson was in the midst of unrest and tanks were rolling out on the streets and police officers were pulling out military-grade equipment and training those guns on young people, and the media was calling me every day and asking me, should President Obama go to Ferguson? And I remember, in fact, being on the Lawrence O'Donnell show one night on MSNBC and being asked that question, you know, should President Obama go? What should the president do? And I was asking a whole different set of questions. I was asking, where's the mayor of this town? It seems so strange to me. Where's the city council president? What other town could there be, right, if this was New York? If this was Baltimore, could they be rolling out military equipment down the main thoroughfare? And the question is about the president, not about the person and the people who are supposed to be running that town. And I remember one day a New York Times reporter called me and asked me again, you know, should President Obama go? And I said to her, can you tell me, this is week 2 of the crisis, can you tell me the name of the mayor of Ferguson? And she couldn't answer it. Now, probably you don't know the name of the mayor of Ferguson. Mayor Knowles. I know it well. That was the first research that I started doing as the unrest occurred. And it was, you know, the first night those tanks were out, it isn't as though I'm pretending that I knew all the right things to do. I just knew what could not happen, and I knew that those police officers could not kill those children, those young people out there protesting. And so I called the governor of Missouri that night. He didn't know me. And I said, you cannot. You must end this curfew. And we continued calling day after day until he called back and said, I have listened, I'm lifting the curfew. But the questions I was asking were always different than what other people were asking. So it was when Baltimore experienced its unrest after the death of Freddie Gray. I was once again, very often in front of the cameras, being asked a set of questions. Now, I should tell you that before Freddie Gray died, after he was arrested, I was very clear that the most important thing that this community would want and deserved was transparency. What happened? Tell the people what happened. Freddie Gray wasn't even dead yet. And I made this appeal to the police chief, Anthony Batts, and others to say, you got to just come out with the truth. Tell the people what happened. That obviously didn't happen. And after Freddie Gray died and the unrest started, I was on several television programs, and I would get asked the same question over and over again. Why, but I don't understand, why are people burning their own community? What about the CVS that people worked so hard to get in this community? I just don't understand why they're doing this. But I had a whole different set of questions. I like this guy. A whole different set of questions that I'm still, you know, some of them I was asking rhetorically. I thought I knew the answer. Some of them I still don't know the answer. Some of them I encourage you to ask yourself. So I asked a whole set of questions that had to do with what I saw. Now, of course, I saw what you saw in terms of the police interaction with Freddie Gray, but my lens was actually quite different. I wanted to know more about the West Baltimore community in which Freddie Gray grew up. I raised my kids in West Baltimore, so I was asking that question rhetorically because I kind of knew the answer. But I wanted, and I was asking the media to ask questions. First of all, I was asking them, why haven't you shown up before today? I remember Wolf Blitzer on CNN kept saying over and over again, a major American city is burning. That was the line, a major American city. And I was thinking, well, wasn't Baltimore a major American city last week and the week before? And why wasn't it deserving of attention on CNN if it's a major American city? Because I didn't see Baltimore on CNN before the unrest. So I had questions that I wanted them to ask about the community in which Freddie Gray grew up. What were the opportunities for Freddie Gray in that community had he lived? What did they think were the opportunities for housing, employment, higher education for Freddie Gray and his family had he lived? It was the same question I asked after Mike Brown was killed. Mike Brown was killed on a Saturday. On a Sunday, his mother, Leslie McSpadden, was on the street, and she said in her grief, she said, do you know what it took for me to get him through high school? And everyone went on asking all the questions about what happened in the encounter between Mike Brown and Officer Darren Wilson. But the question stays with me. Well, what did it take? And why did it take all of that? So I wanted to ask questions about, had Freddie Gray lived when I knew there would be no cameras in West Baltimore, what were his chances for a full and productive life? So I ask you to sit with that set of questions, because there are other Freddie Grays out there who we're not talking about just because they're alive. And yet we haven't answered the questions of what kind of life can they expect. I wanted to know, how is it possible that Freddie Gray and his sister could be, as has been reported, so severely lead paint poisoned in the 1990s, when all the data has been known, and lead paint has been banned for decades in Europe. We've known this since the 1920s and before. And I worked on lead paint cases when I first came to Baltimore. So how's that possible? We had a Lead Paint Poisoning Prevention Act passed in Maryland in 1996. So how's that possible? Haven't seen that follow-up story yet. The CVS. Why just the CVS? Why, when I look out on this block, don't I see Cohen's Optical, PetSmart, Giant, Whole Foods? I don't know, you name the store. Is all this passion for small business and for property that I heard that week really just about the CVS and the Easy Tobacco Mart next to it? Why did it take so much to get a CVS in this community? Why does that block look the way it looks? I know the governor opened a temporary office in West Baltimore. And I thought, why doesn't the governor have an office in West Baltimore? Baltimore is not exactly irrelevant to Maryland. Populous city, rich history, culture, all of the things that people come to Maryland for are pretty much in Baltimore. So why doesn't the governor already have an office in West Baltimore that focuses on small businesses and so forth? The rough ride. Well, what is it about the state of Baltimore's streets and infrastructure that make it possible that you could be injured just from riding down the street and not wearing a seatbelt? Well, I could go on and on, but these were some of the questions that I began grappling with. And I'll tell you that it's part of the reason why, when the governor decided in June to cancel plans for the Red Line subway system, which had been planned for 15 years in Baltimore, first of all, I think we were all shocked, because this was a critically important project, not perfect, but critically important project to opening the valve that keeps so many communities in Baltimore locked in. I met with the Secretary of Transportation, Anthony Fox, and I shared with him my own experience. I said, when I would get up early in West Baltimore, I could see at the bus stop, driving in my car downtown, women standing at the bus stop in the dark, early, to get to jobs here at Hopkins in East Baltimore. And what it takes on a Baltimore City bus, I remember I worked right downtown at University of Maryland Law School, 17 minutes door to door from the far end of West Baltimore. On a bus, it could take an hour and a half. So if your shift starts at 7, then that woman has left her children to get to school on their own, to get breakfast on their own. And when that child arrives at school late, or has been bullied, or doesn't have their homework, or hasn't eaten, we all have a lot of judgments about that mother and about that family. So I see transportation not only as a civil rights issue, which is the mantra I've been pushing, but I see it also as a feminist issue. Women need safe public transportation. Okay, but I'm running out of time, so let me get to what I really want to suggest to you, and I teed up the transportation piece because I want to talk about something that we generally tend not to talk about in the civil rights realm, and it really has to do with how we unlock opportunity for our families and our communities. My organization, so let me just cut to the chase. We filed a civil rights complaint against the state and the governor for the cancellation of the Red Line. This administrative complaint is currently with the Department of Transportation, and they are investigating the claim now because, of course, we argue that the cancellation of the Red Line has a disparate impact on African Americans in the state, because all of that money is being used for roads and bridges in the suburban counties. And I really encourage you to get involved with these issues because this is really what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about investments, massive investments, what we need for our communities in ways that I think exist behind the veil. And I think we need it because if we're to talk about race and policing, we have to try to understand, how did we get where we are? How did we get to a point where the nation could watch a video of a man running down a street and being shot in the back, like Walter Scott was in North Charleston, as though he were prey? I mean, after all, it isn't only that Officer Lohman killed Tamir Rice in 2 seconds, but it's also that they grabbed his sister and put her down on the ground when she was screaming because she saw that her brother had been shot, and handcuffed her and put her in the back of the police car and told the mother as she screamed, "If you don't stop screaming, I'll arrest you too." Right? There's something else going on here. And it has to do with our failure to be able to see humanity in one another. So, this is, of course, not without its racial dimension. There is no question. And that racial dimension to it was forecast by my own organization in 1954 when we litigated the Brown versus Board of Education case. Now, when the Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education, the court said about segregation that segregation harmed black children because segregation was meant to send a message of inferiority. And I think that is true. I know many of you can say, my black school was wonderful. I know what you're going to say. I'm saying what the Supreme Court was saying is when the state says that black and white people have to be separated, they are saying it for the purpose of sending a message of racial subordination of black people. They are sending a message of white supremacy. They weren't saying, isn't it lovely that black people are doing this over here and we're doing this over here? They were saying there's something about black people that we should not commingle and be near them. And it was powerful and important for the Supreme Court to acknowledge that. But I want to suggest that what the Supreme Court acknowledged was unequal. They talked about the harm of segregation to black children, but they never talked about the harm of segregation to white children. Now I want to say that the reason I emphasize this is because one of the most remarkable things about the Brown case was that they cited this social science data that we had accumulated about the harms of segregation. And that's where they cited the work of Dr. Kenneth Clark, who did the famous doll test that many of you may have heard about, where African-American children preferred the white doll, thought the white doll was good, etc. And it showed how these deeply ingrained messages of subordination were in black children. But what I want to tell you is that the appendix to the brief that we filed in Brown versus Board of Education, an appendix that was signed by over 30 social scientists, including Dr. Clark, also talked about the harm of segregation to white children. And I want to read you some of what it said and see if this sounds a little bit familiar. The social scientists warned, children who learn the prejudices of our society are also being taught, they were talking about white children now, to gain personal status in an unrealistic and non-adaptive way. When comparing themselves to members of the minority group, they are not required to evaluate themselves in terms of actual personal ability and achievement. They often develop patterns of guilt feelings, rationalizations, and other mechanisms which they must use in an attempt to protect themselves from recognizing the essential injustice of their unrealistic fears and hatreds of minority groups. White children experience, they continued, confusion, conflict, moral cynicism, respect for authority may arise in majority group children as a consequence of being taught the moral, religious, and democratic principles of the brotherhood of man and the importance of justice and fair play by the same persons and institutions who, in their support of racial segregation and related practices, seem to be acting in a prejudiced and discriminatory manner. The social scientists further warned that some individuals may attempt to resolve this conflict by intensifying their hostility towards the minority group. Still others react by developing an unwholesome, rigid, and uncritical idealization of all authority figures, their parents, strong political and economic leaders. They despise the weak, while they obsequiously and unquestioningly conform to the demands of the strong, whom they also paradoxically, subconsciously hate. From the earliest school years, children are not only aware of the status differences among different groups in the society, but begin to react to the patterns described above. So that never showed up in the Brown opinion. I can understand. It would have been hard, probably, in 1954 to get a unanimous court to get on board with that. But I want you to know that this was predicted. And we have to begin to grapple with the consequences of living in a segregated society, living in a hyper-segregated society. And so when I talk about the importance of integration, and I talk about both racial and socioeconomic integration, I'm not talking about it because, some magic happens when a person sits next to a person of another race. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if we are to be a city, Baltimore, a state, Maryland, a country, the United States, we cannot go on like this. We cannot continue in this manner. So what does it take? I was sharing with my dear colleague Deborah Small earlier that people get nervous because they feel like the problem is too big and we can't solve it. And I reject that out of hand. I also have colleagues who say, you can't expect government to solve the problem. And I reject that out of hand. They can't solve it entirely. But, I like to look at the ways in which government has done a remarkably, fascinatingly excellent job of addressing some things. So, for example, our segregated society is not something that just happened. It didn't just materialize out of thin air. It is largely the creation of government policy, not the creation of mean people who didn't want black people to live next door to them. There's some of that too, don't get me wrong. But largely, it happens as a result of government policy. What are those government policies? Well, beginning in the 1930s, when the federal government begins insuring mortgages, it does so on a segregated basis. In fact, it was the government, it was the FHA, that insisted that communities remain segregated, including here in Baltimore, and provided sample racially restrictive covenants for deeds because they believed that was the only way to maintain the property value was to ensure that there was not race mixing. So what you see in Baltimore, the landscape you see, was not just given to us from above. It was created by a set of government policies. When the government decided after World War II that they wanted to create a white middle class, that they wanted to support the GIs who returned home, they created a GI Bill, which provided educational opportunity and housing opportunity for whites who never before would have been able to afford it. We created an interstate highway system paid for with public funds, billions of dollars, that made the creation of the white suburbs possible. If your parents bought a house in the suburbs, they benefited from this. Racially restrictive covenants kept blacks from living in those suburbs, and so they were created for white people. That's how the landscape became what it looks like today, not by happenstance, by a series of government policies and investments. And just as the government advanced these policies and these investments, I say this to you because I want us to believe and understand that so too can we make decisions that would advance different policies and different investments. I want to be clear, the federal government always makes investments. I don't care what they say about balancing the budget and the national debt and all that stuff. We decided to invest in mental illness, poverty, addiction, and race problems. And we call it the prison system. That was the decision. That was a massive investment that was made to paper over a set of problems that they chose not to engage. And now we see that many people recognize that the criminal justice system has gotten out of control, that mass incarceration must be reversed, so we're getting ready to make other decisions. That's why now's the time. So we can make other decisions that will unlock some of this. And that's why we filed that complaint in the Red Line case. Because you should be asking yourself, if you visited any other major American city, why Baltimore doesn't have a real subway system that serves east to west where black people live. Because it's not about just removing people from communities, it's about making those communities vital. It's about fostering interaction between different people. It's moving people out of the 6 blocks in West Baltimore where they grew up and allowing them to be across town. It's providing that interaction between people of different socioeconomic statuses, between people of different races, that give us a chance, just a chance, to see the humanity in another person. And currently, our physical landscape, our government policies, the decisions that we've made to remain separate in housing, in education, all of this don't even give us a fighting chance to do that. So when I look at the issue of policing, and we're working very hard in North Charleston, South Carolina, we work in New York, and obviously Baltimore. We've been really pushing for the Department of Justice to include school police in the Baltimore pattern and practice investigation in which they're currently involved. We've been doing lots of work in all of these towns, but a key part of what we're looking at is the issue of the patterns that were created, that were locked into place, that we have now accepted as though they are air, when they were created for us. And we are living in them, and they are not working. And you are still paying your taxes. So we have the opportunity at this moment to make different decisions about our future, to make different decisions about how we want to organize ourselves, to make different decisions about who we want to be as a city, as a state, as a country. And I invite you to join me in thinking big, in reimagining the entire landscape that has been handed to us and that no longer serves us, if it ever did. So I thank you for this opportunity, and I really look forward to the conversation. Thank you.